Welcome, everybody. It's great to see you all here tonight, and I'm particularly happy to welcome back my former student, Alex Christofi, who wasn't here that long ago, I think now, actually. I mean, it was you came in 2005 and you left in 2008, so you're really quite a recent graduate of this college, although Alex actually wasn't here when this existed, so this is kind of interesting. So Alex is a writer, an editor, a publisher. I think all of those things are right. And the last time he was here, I actually heard him read out passages from A Work in Progress, and we can return to that later on. But he's been very busy since then. So in 2015, he published his first novel called Glass, which tells the story of Gunter Glass, a 22-year-old half-German window cleaner.
Forgive me.
Yes, it's actually very funny. I really like this novel. I've read it quite recently, so I thought I'd just mention this. And he actually won the 2016 Betty Trask Prize for that, which is very impressive. And then in 2017, you published your second novel, Let Us Be True, about a German-born couple falling in love in post-war France. I think it's actually set in France in the year before I was born, which is interesting.
Oh, really?
Thought I'd mention that, yes. And more recently, in fact, in January 2021, he published a much acclaimed and really, I think, very well reviewed, quite short biography or fictional, quasi-fictional biography of Dostoevsky called Dostoevsky in Love, An Intimate Life, which is a really good read, actually. Just thought I'd mention this. And in the meantime, I mean, or concurrently, I should say, I think Alex has been working in publishing. So you've been commissioning editor for non-fiction at One World, and then in April 2020 joined Transworld Publishers as an editorial director in the non-fiction team.
Yes, that's right.
Good.
Yeah.
So have I missed any critical episodes in your? I mean, I have missed out critical episodes, but does that about sum it up?
Yeah, that's the highlights.
Right.
The nice thing with having the CV read out is that you miss out all the bits where you didn't get things right or things didn't come off. So it sounds really impressive when you cut all those bits out.
Yeah, I know, it's interesting. It's the sort of CV life as opposed to the real life, which is a lot messier usually.
The success is not linear as it looks in retrospect.
So how are we going to play this evening is that I'm going to begin by talking to Alex a little bit and asking him a few questions about his work. And then we also have with us on stage Ivan Harjehausen, I've got that right, haven't I? And then Patrick Dybell. And Ivan is a visiting student who is not studying literature, but actually has an interest in Dostoevsky. Great. And Patrick is studying English and French and is very interested, obviously, in the study of literature, but also in creative writing. And Brilliant. In fact, has relaunched the Beaufort Society as the Beaufort Salon, which has its first meeting in the lodgings on Saturday afternoon. So that's all pretty cool.
Brilliant.
So after that, we'll open up the floor for some questions for people who'd like to ask things of Alex. So I have to ask you the question. What I didn't ask you at the time, but did you like being here? And what did you most enjoy about studying English at LMH?
Yeah, I loved being here. I guess I always liked the idea that I could be kind of sent somewhere for 3 years where my job was to read books, and then you could tell that to people and they wouldn't sort of require you to do something else, because when I was going through school, you like reading books, but then I had my weekend job stacking shelves at the Sainsbury's and a bunch of other things going on as well. I really liked to be able to immerse myself in it properly, and actually it was the first time that I really realised that you get something different from books when you read them more than once, when you're able to read all of an author's works in one go, or just really given the space to properly interrogate what literature can do when you kind of when you start to take apart the pieces. So I absolutely loved it, and I think it really expanded my understanding of what literature could do for not just as in a kind of vocational way, but just for your soul. Yeah, I think it's even if I had done nothing related to literature in my career, I think it would have just been a lovely thing to have understood what it was capable of, and how fulfilling it could be to read literature.
So when you were here and you were studying literature and analysing and writing critical essays, did you write creatively then? And did you think that you might be a writer?
I was much more certain that I was a writer at the age of 18 than I am now. I started off writing poetry, and a friend asked if she was doing a sort of scratch night of short plays at one point, and so she asked if I would write a short play, and the fact of having been asked was amazing, because I never considered the idea that I could be a playwright. So I sort of dipped my toe in that. I think that, writing books, it is such a continuous effort that it didn't really occur to me that was an option until later on. But I was always kind of interested in figuring out how to sort of write persuasively and articulate myself on the page. It always felt like a really kind of productive, useful way to order my thoughts.
So you made a rather funny video of yourself, actually, which anybody can see on YouTube. It's the one where you're advertising your novel Glass, and it's the one where you're actually cleaning windows in your publishers. And you tell me, I'm ashamed to say, that you've never cleaned a window in your life before, which I find quite hard to believe, actually. But there we go. But you make some very funny comments when you're cleaning windows, and you said how you secretly kept your writing life going at weekends when you were working full-time in a publishers, and that you were sort of beavering away writing fiction. And you said that you'd already written a novel, and then you said that it was really a load of pretentious rubbish. What happened to that novel?
Well, it's not. I'm not going to kind of keep it in a locker and then sort of leave it in my will so that an executor can display. It's been disposed of.
The Lady Margaret Hall Library. That's it. Thank you for our archive collection. Yeah.
No one would want this. I think it would be a terrible piece of genetic criticism, because it's just all of the clever thoughts I had. It was strung into a sort of very unworkable narrative. I think it paid almost no heed to the person reading it, that was to read it, and for that reason it was a really kind of deliciously pretentious piece of writing that will never see the light of day.
There's something interesting you just said there about it paying no heed to the person who is reading it. Is that something you think about a lot when you write? I mean, what would somebody think about when they were reading a work that you'd written?
Yeah, I mean, I think fundamentally writing is an act of communication. It's easy to get lost in the kind of nuances of debates about whether the author is the sole interpreter of a text, or whether the reader should kind of take the text out of the context of authorship and so on. But fundamentally, it's an act of communication, and I think 99% of the time, clarity is what will serve best your intentions. That there can be ambiguities, but certainly I found early on in developing my writing skills that I would often forgive myself for confusions in the writing with the kind of catch-all of ambiguity. And I think being a clear writer has helped me a lot.
And that's something that you felt that you've learned as you've gone along?
Yeah, I think, very often there are flaws you can't see in your own writing until you've had a bit of distance from them and you've left the writing in a drawer, or you've kind of come back to it a little while later. And I think one of the things that always annoys me in retrospect is when I've written something that could have been more directly communicated and was sort of, I talked around it for too long without really coming to the point. So I've over the years, I've sort of tried to do that less and less, and I think my style has probably become plainer over time. But hopefully the positive result is that it's become a bit more readable. Yeah,
I just got one last question before I hand over to Ivan. I looked at a piece that you'd written in a blog of yours, which I thought was really nice and actually very good advice to students here. I'm going to read a little bit out of it. It's the one
Sure.
which you, I think, possibly gave as a talk to your old school.
Oh, yeah.
The one on life as a journey or a navigation, actually. And I thought this is actually really rather good advice to students. I'll just quote a passage from it where you talk about life as a journey, a type of navigation or in a boat, actually, and perhaps a sea-bound boat. You have done amazing things with your life. You have amazing things ahead of you. This isn't a waiting room. This is already real life. There is no master plan. On the best days, you manage to find one of those tiny islands in the middle of a huge ocean. Enjoy that moment. It's incredible to think that you have got exactly where you wanted to go just by heading in roughly the right direction, day after day, and trying not to be blown off course. Better still, the next day you wake up, and it is one of those rare days when you know exactly where you are and you can choose where you go next. You have not reached America yet, but this is the exciting part. Out here on the water, some days you might feel a bit lost or even lose heart. That happens to everyone, but never doubt what you are capable of. On those days when everything ahead of you looks like an empty sea, all you need to do is look back and you'll see how far you've come. So I think that's very good. I've got just one very last question, actually, and I know that Ivan will probably talk about this some more. I kept thinking about that novel called Glass, and you've got a kind of bad joke in it, if you don't mind me saying so. You've got a hero called Gunter Glass, which is dreadful, actually. I mean,
it's really bad,
it's a kind of pun on, obviously, Gunter Grass, who's the author of The Tin Drum. And then you've got a character in it called the Steppenwolf, who is, of course, that's the title of that Hermann Hesse novel called Steppenwolf, which I, as a teenager, absolutely loved, and it was like my iconic book. And then that recent work that you've written, the novel Let Us Be True, you've got, again, these central characters called Ralph and Elsa, one of whom you say is sort of German-Jewish and the other one is Germanic or Aryan.
Yeah.
What is it that attracts you to German literary tradition? You're not German yourself, as in I am actually half German. You
are.
Don't know this about me, but
yeah.
I'm just kind of interested in why you write about that. What is it that draws you to that period?
I think there was no conscious decision actually to do it twice. I think one thing that I've always that has always preoccupied me hugely and just kind of comes out in my writing whether I want it to or not is this idea of mixed or split identities, because I'm actually half Cypriot, which is sort of really a kind of a proxy. A lot of my characters will have split loyalties, and one of the big questions for Dostoevsky was whether he should be orientated towards this European culture or the kind of Asiatic Slavophile version of Russia that was a bit more closed off. So in that way, it was a sort of proxy for my own feeling of having an in-between identity, and feeling that it was probably one that was more instinctively understood by English readers. I also think some of the other themes that I was trying to explore to do with national identity and the inheritance of that of the kind of mid-20th century, the huge political ructions in Europe and the Second World War, not least of which, it made sort of Germany specifically became the kind of obvious route into that, exploring those themes. So it wasn't really a conscious decision, is the honest answer. But I see now that it was my sort of quickest route to the things I was trying to explore.
Brilliant. Okay, thank you. I'll hand over now to Ivan, I think.
Hello. Oh, okay, there we go. Hi, Alex. Well, it's great to be talking with you today. So I'm Ivan. I'm from the United States. I'm a visiting student here, and I'm studying experimental psychology.
Great.
And I got really interested I read Brothers Karamazov by Dostoevsky about 3 years ago, and have been more and more attracted to Russian literature in particular, and I'm still trying to figure out why, but it's something about the passion and seeing different sides of people, and I think Dostoevsky in particular does a great job of showing the internal psychology of people and their thoughts in ways that are very like, intimate and very authentic. So anyways, at first, I wanted to ask you some questions about themes within Dostoevsky's writing, and then move on to your book, Dostoevsky in Love in particular, and about your writing style with that, and then finally close off with some lessons that you've learned along the way. How does that sound?
Yeah, that sounds great.
Great. So one of the major themes within Dostoevsky's work is suffering and then also religion. And so I was wondering what your thoughts are on like what is Dostoevsky's message bringing together like the meaning of life and suffering and combining that with religion.
Yeah, I mean, orthodoxy, I think, it's almost impossible to talk about how he saw the world and how he saw the value of the human being without talking about Russian Orthodoxy. I think this really kind of came into view for him most clearly when he was sent to Siberia effectively as a revolutionary. He was subjected to this mock execution and then sent to Siberia to do hard labor for 4 years, and there was another few years after that he wasn't allowed back to St. Petersburg or Moscow. And in that time he was brought up religious, but he I think understood quite what the peasant class, which was 90%, 95% of the population, that was the majority of the prisoners that he had to share his barracks with. He wasn't allowed any reading material, but he did have a New Testament with him, at least for a couple of years until it was stolen and sold for alcohol money by one of the other prisoners. I think it gave him the space and time that he needed to think really deeply about what was the sort of moral foundation of Russia in his lifetime. And he came out of it feeling very, very strongly that it was one of the answers to what would renew Russian society. That they had to be kind of firm in their faith, and that they also had to get back to understanding the kind of common people. I think where that comes into, I think his relationship to suffering is complicated, and so it's hard to sum up. I think there are people who suffer in his writing as a way of exploring the ways that society is unfairly structured. I also think there are people who suffer because on some fundamental level, I think he believes that suffering is necessary in order to sort of fully understand the grace of God. But it's sometimes hard to disentangle which is happening at any given moment. But there is a moment in one of his short stories that's not as well known. There's a story called The Dream of a Ridiculous Man, which is, he writes in 1878, so it's 3 years before he dies, where the main character says, I need suffering in order to love. Without suffering, we don't really understand the obverse. And I think Dostoevsky was sincere when he wrote that.
So I was just reading Dostoevsky in Love, your book today, and it seems that there's a lot of parallels of Dostoevsky suffering in his own life and trying to find meaning in his own life. One line that stuck out from Brothers Karamazov to me is this idea of without God or morality, all things are permissible. And like what Dostoevsky was famous for, like you said, being an Orthodox Christian, but also being eloquent and talking about his like doubts. So like in modern day, with a lot of people not being as religious, how do you balance, or how do you put together that morality, the need for morality in society if there isn't a God or if you don't believe in God? Does that make sense?
Yeah. I think what he would say is absolutely. If you take God out of the equation, what you get is nihilism, where there's no moral backstop, and so it's very hard to stop yourself from sliding into a situation where there is no fundamentally there's no moral guarantee underpinning society. I think he wrote really well about spiritual doubt, and one of the things that I think is a really interesting challenge that I haven't read from others, at least any of his contemporaries, about those who suffer from spiritual doubt is he writes in it just actually after he comes out of prison. Someone wrote to him saying, you know, I'm really struggling with my faith at the moment. And part of his response was, even out of those who dispute the existence of Jesus or the idea that Jesus was really the Son of God, even those people don't dispute that Jesus was the ideal of how to behave, a model human, and gave us a model for our ethics. So, you know, as someone who's not institutionally religious in the same way as he is, I found that a really interesting kind of provocation to atheists or agnostic people.
Yeah, there's still like a reason to be moral even if you're, you know, don't fully believe or aren't fully in the institution. Interesting. So I want to move on to your writing style, and this is really interesting. It's a blend of sort of you make up your as I understand it, your own like dialogue to illustrate some of the episodes in Dostoevsky's life. And for me, when I was reading, I thought that gave the book a lot of character and a lot of authenticity, because you can imagine these scenes, and it's more engaging than just reading a sentence about so-and-so thing happened on so-and-so date. So I was wondering how do you think about blending like fiction and the narrative and biography together, and how do you find your own narrative voice within that?
I think the most important thing is that you are very clear what your ground rules are. And so I write at the very, before you can get any of the Dostoevsky stuff, you have to read my boring preface where I say, please don't treat this as an academic book. It's not, that these sections are not strictly factual. These, you know, anything in quote marks can be taken as a fact that was reported by contemporaries. Anything in italics is paraphrased from Dostoevsky's writing. So I think you have to be clear with the reader, otherwise the tendency is for these things to become apocryphal or to sort of slip into received wisdom about what is and isn't true over the years. But I'm fascinated by people who kind of find ways of blurring the line between fact and fiction. So at one end of the spectrum, Kurtzer wrote this wonderful novel called The Master of St. Petersburg about Dostoevsky, very much a fictional episode. He writes about the death of a son, and Dostoevsky didn't, or the death of a stepson, who absolutely didn't die when he's purported to have in the novel. But Kurtzer's son did die, and it's I think a very emotionally true novel, despite the sort of facticity of it is not. But it's very evocative of the time and place, and I think it sort of reaches towards something that's very true about the way Dostoevsky saw the world. On the other end of the spectrum, you have kind of conventional biographies that follow kind of academic rigor. And I was kind of curious about whether it was possible to do something that kind of fell between the two. So there's a writer I love called Emmanuel Carrère who writes very essayistic. Officially they're novels, but it's France, so like everything's a novel. And he wrote this wonderful book called Limonov, which is a novel, apparently. But it's kind of a biography, and it's of a real guy who is alive still, I think. And he kind of blends his writings, which were quite autobiographical, but certainly autofictional, with his account of the writer's life. And it gives you this amazing sense of interiority. It's not strictly a biography, but it does give you a real insight into Limonov as a figure and how he sees the world. Mm-hmm. So I was trying to do that, but it's kind of up to readers as to whether it was successful.
Well, on my end, I would say I felt like it felt very real. I feel like I got to know Dostoevsky more as like a person, and some of the struggles and difficulty he went through. Kind of like you were saying earlier, success is not linear, but in hindsight, it can look very linear. So you might look at his life and say, well, he published several super famous books and must have had like a good life then. But there were clearly, if you go and read the book, there's a lot of difficulties where he struggles with a gambling addiction, has multiple failed love affairs. And some parts are just like outright comical, I think, when like he comes back from an extended stay in Europe where he was gambling, and he comes back home and finds that his stepson sold all of his books or pawned off his stuff, I think I just burst out laughing. It's like, oh, welcome home. All your stuff's gone. I sold it.
Yeah, he's a very funny guy. He had a great sense of humor, but it's a kind of a black humor, and I think it doesn't. I think people sometimes miss it. Maybe it's partly the translation, or maybe it's because there's this impression of him as a very serious, frowny, grumpy man with a big beard, and so the tendency is to kind of bring our preconceptions to it. But yeah, you're absolutely right. It's funny. Yeah. I think so.
Great. So I've just got one more question, and then I'm going to pass it over to Patrick. So through writing this book, what things did you learn on the process of writing in terms of maybe like trying to stay disciplined or motivated, or alternatively, maybe how did you develop as a writer or as a person? I'm going to leave that open to interpretation for you. Where you want to take that?
Yeah. It was I really had to stay disciplined to get the project finished because it was there was just such a lot of work to read. So his collected volumes are pretty dense, 30 volumes, and there is kind of secondary material to read as well. So it was because I was doing this on, I work Monday to Thursday for my day job as a publisher, and then I write on Fridays. And so you say, oh, you've got 2 years to write the book, and 2 years sounds like ages. But then if you say you've got 100 days to write the book, suddenly it doesn't seem like quite as much time. So I had to be super disciplined on a writing day to get up early and not really take too many breaks and things. But I learned a huge amount. I think because I was, as we were talking about, I was kind of interpolating bits of his writing with mine and trying to find ways to kind of blend the two together. It forced me to work really closely with his text, and albeit in English. And so I kind of, the longer you spend with a single writer, the more that you sort of start to learn the kind of clockwork of the craft. So I loved doing that. I found it. I mean, I'm not going to turn into a kind of pastiche Dostoevsky writer, but I loved learning kind of how he set up scenes so that the conflict came out as it did, or actually one of the things I think he's amazing at is to find ways to dramatize ideas. So he won't very, I mean, he will sometimes have people just sort of saying what they think out loud in a conversation. But what he's really good at is taking two people who stand for something quite different from one another and finding a situation where those two things come into conflict and turning the ideas into human drama, which is really the engine of narrative. And I learned a huge amount from him about that.
Can I just while we're still on that biography, just ask one further question about it. I mean, yeah. I remember opening, I think it was the Sunday Times, and I thought, oh look, that's my student Alex Christofi. Oh, he's got like an amazing review for this book. Oh, this is really good. You know, I was reading it, and it was like it was very complimentary actually about what you've done. And I think your reviews in general were really good. I mean, they were very positive,
very generous,
you would say that, wouldn't you? I think they were accurately good. But it was interesting. I was just reading recently, in fact last weekend, a review by a historian of Joe Mashenko's recent book on Milton. I don't know if you've come across this.
I haven't read it yet.
No, but it's interesting because that also, in a slightly different way, but it accesses Milton through acts of imaginary creation. I mean, a lot of it is not real, basically. And the historian who was, I was trying to think who the author was of the review, but he was actually very critical of, I mean, he wasn't critical of Joe's writing style, but very much of the practice of accessing a kind of biographical subject through a world of imagined episodes when in fact so much happened in Milton's life that really was, you know, full of drama. So why do you need to do this? So I suppose my question is, to what extent did you get sort of reviewers who criticised what you'd done and just said, well, you know, if you're writing a biography, why do you have to interpolate it with fictional episodes?
Yeah, I've had a few people kind of ask about. I mean, the way it's mainly framed to me is, and I kind of agree with them, is that it's basically an act of terrible hubris because Joseph Frank is this amazing scholar who wrote a 5-volume biography of Dostoevsky, and it took him from 1976 to 2002. And it's, you know, pretty widely regarded as one of the best biographies of any writer in any language. You know, it's kind of definitive in a way that mine could never be. But I guess my view was always that I wanted to sort of find a way to make him feel accessible to kind of bridge the gap between popular readers and loads of people in the academy already study Dostoevsky and have much more to say than I do, but I felt like there was in some ways a disconnect, and he was seen among a lot of popular readers as being kind of a difficult writer, an intimidating one. He's got these kind of long books, and maybe even that he's just kind of unfashionable because he's seen as coming as part and parcel of this received canon. So it was really a project to sort of rescue him from that reputation, rather than to overwrite other scholarship. That was at least my apologia for my work.
Well, and it works as well, and because you open in such a very dramatic way, you know, it's difficult not to it's difficult to put it down. Actually, I think once you get past the opening section,
Thank you.
Which is good. Anybody who reads it will see this is the moment at which Dostoevsky actually describes the experience of nearly being executed, actually being about a minute away from death, which is pretty dramatic.
Yeah. Yeah, it's the Netflix opening of the biography.
Okay, brilliant. Okay, I'll hand it over to Patrick now. Yeah.
So I'll try not to deafen anyone with the mic. So as Christine said, I've just started here at Oxford. So I'm entering into this period, as you said briefly earlier, of being ensconced in great work, great writers, which I think leads quite nicely onto my first question. How do we take on great work? How do we become enamoured, like you did with Dostoevsky, but remain faithful to ourselves in our originality? How do we not become too influenced, if you will, by these great writers that we read?
I don't worry too much, at least anymore, about being too kind of swayed and kind of dragged off course by a particular writer. I think, like, you know, every very good writer has a different lesson to teach you, and it all becomes sort of part of your toolkit, I suppose, as a reader or as a writer. But I always worried about whether I was doing it wrong, because the problem with English, with studying literature at all, is that you're just left alone for hours at a time, completely unsupervised. And what if you're getting it wrong? No one tells you, at least until, you know, much later on. And then it's too late. You already read it, and you might not go back to it. But I always like the analogy that I would draw is that I started off going to art galleries knowing that I knew nothing about art, and I would sort of dutifully spend exactly at least 45 and no more than 1 minute 15 on every picture in the whole exhibition, and I'd read all the captions, and then I'd come out of it feeling like I'd sort of covered it, and I kind of came to thinking that's maybe the wrong attitude. Like, you know, that sometimes you do, if you don't look carefully, you do miss things. But actually now, if I go and see an exhibition, I first of all trust my instinct about what I'm drawn to. If there's a room full of 8 paintings and I want to spend 5 minutes looking at one of them and no time on the rest, I will do that. And then afterwards, I think, is the job of interpreting and figuring out why this one, why did I feel that way? Why did it have that impact on me? And I think that's about having a confidence in your personal response, and that it's not having an engagement with art can't be inauthentic. You know, if you love something, there will be a reason why you love it.
So you think it's more of a continuous process rather than a large event that's happened?
Yeah, I mean, I think it's. I think over time you kind of learn to trust your instincts, and you're never going to have exactly the same responses as everyone else. It's not, you know, there are, one of the lovely things about studying literature is that people can sort of teach you how to see, and they kind of point things out to you that once you've noticed them, they add such detail and texture, and it helps to kind of bring the dimensions of a piece of writing out. But if you love one thing, and if you love Austen and not Dickens, that it's okay. There are people who love Dickens and not Austen. He'll be fine.
And I did also explore your website as well. I read a few of the articles.
Oh, great.
And one of them in particular was brilliant. I found it fascinating. And it was so fascinating that I couldn't believe it was true, even. It was the tumbleweeding one.
Yeah.
And just for those who haven't read this or aren't aware of the concept, could you maybe introduce this idea, how you ended up doing this, and maybe the consequences?
So it's this amazing shop in Paris called Shakespeare and Company. It was founded in the early 20th century by a woman called Sylvia Beach, and it had been closed down in the Second World War, and was sort of brought back to life again by a man called George Whitman. So after the Second World War, there was this period that it was the main hangout of the sort of lost generation, so it was the kind of Hemingway type era. And then after the war, it then became a hangout for all the beat poets and James Baldwin and this generation of 50s expat, particularly American writers. And it's kept going to this day, and it's become a bit of a sort of site of pilgrimage for lovers of literature all around the world. It's just opposite Notre Dame, so you have these amazing views out the window, and they still is only 2 floors in the shop, and they still maintain one of them. They don't sell any of those books. It's a library. You can go and sit there and sit down and read a book. So it has this great tradition of having slightly resisted the inherently capitalist nature of being a bookshop. And one of the things that they have done for a long time was to have tumbleweeds, which is young writers who want to be in Paris, but they can't necessarily afford to have anywhere to stay, can apply to go there and help volunteer for a couple of hours a day, doing some answering queries and helping to stock the shelves and things. And in return, you get to sleep there. Once you've closed up shop, you put up all the old wooden boards and you bring the shelves in from outside, and then they kind of lock you in and leave you alone. And so I slept on a bench by a piano, and there was one person in a kind of little nook above the children's books, and it was amazing, actually. Met some really, really lovely people there, and it was to be able to wake up in the morning, open the curtains and see Notre Dame is a kind of unique experience. I mean, it will be unique for me. I'm never going to be. I think I'm too old. They won't let me go back now.
You speak as well about one of your characters, Ralph, and how you looked out the window and you could see or imagine where he would have went to go and see live jazz bands. And so I was wondering whether that was a formative experience for you and you feel like you need to experience things in order to write about them, or whether you can go via pure imagination.
I do think that imagination has to serve a part. I think people always say, write what you know, right? And I think the temptation is to take that as literally as possible, and so you would kind of take that to mean that you should be writing something that's pretty auto-fictional and quite true to life. I think what the important thing is that something is emotionally true, that you're taking things that you feel very deeply, images that really resonate with you, not necessarily cribbing, humans that you know in real life wholesale, but a particular characteristic or interaction that you think is really telling, that really helps to sort of prove something, even if you don't quite know what it is yet. Gathering those impressions and then reforming them into fiction. I think that's how you create something that sort of really lives on the page. I think the danger with imagining things completely from scratch is that it might not ring true to someone who sort of, if I've never been to Central Africa and I start writing about it, there might be elemental things that I'm getting wrong that won't ring true to people who know it much better than I do. So it's kind of about balancing. It's partly about research, but I think it's partly about writing something that feels true to your life experience.
And so when you're dealing with such personal emotions, do you find the editing process difficult because you've crafted this novel and then you need to cut it? Is this something productive or is it painful in a way?
I think if you do it too quickly, it can be painful. I think that's probably why you do need to leave it in a drawer a bit. When you write the first draft, you're sort of writing it for you, and then you have to kind of try to get a bit of distance from it, and then look at it just as a piece of text. What will it do for a reader who doesn't know me? What will it bring out in them, or what's it asking them to do? What's it asking them to imagine? What kind of journey is it taking them on? And at that point, it becomes a much more functional thing where, I have a very clear memory from when I was sort of 3 or 4. It's one of my first memories of my dad was working in the garden, and I was messing around with a hammer trying to knock all the little thorns off of the roses because I didn't want my dad to hurt his finger. It means a lot to me, but it's so cliched. As a piece of writing, it wouldn't work because the rose has all this freight, and I also it wouldn't fit into any of the things I'm trying to write. So those sorts of things, that's where this idea that you have to kill your darlings comes in. That phrase is, I think, about that. It's about being able to maintain enough distance that you're being clear what purpose things serve for the unknown reader.
Perfect. I don't want to speak for too long because I know we have questions coming in from the audience. Sure. But just a last question. You did mention that you balance writing with working in publishing. And I was wondering how you, first of all, entered into writing. And is there something about the publishing industry that you would like to change? Something that would help writers, if you will? Yeah.
I got into writing it was a very sort of gradual process of keeping on going, drafting different things and sending them to friends, sending them for feedback to when I was writing plays to theatres or whatever, and making it into a habit rather than writing one thing and resting back on my laurels again. The sort of terrifying thing about Tennyson that I remember from studying Victorian literature here was that he used to he wasn't allowed to have breakfast until he wrote a poem. I mean, I'm not like that, but I do think it's a habit. And I think it sort of helps to kind of learn a bit about, as I was working in publishing, to just learn a bit about how the industry is, how it's set up. How it is that it's best to approach a literary agent and what they're looking for and that kind of thing. I think it's actually got a lot more transparent since I started working in publishing. I think there's more information online now than there ever was when I started in publishing, even 10, 15 years ago. But I think publishing probably, the thing that most needs to change is to just be a bit more representative of the population. So I think it is still hard for working class writers to break in. It remains very middle class. I don't think that it's kind of representative demographically of the diversity of Britain, of modern Britain. It's still very white. So I think it needs to sort of update itself a bit and be more inclusive in that way. But it is still a really exciting industry to work in, and I think it's full of people who have a lot of goodwill, who kind of want to have a publishing industry that everyone's proud of.
Perfect. Are we moving on to the questions online now? Yes.
Unless there's anything else that you want.
No, I think all my pressing questions are answered.
So normally we take a question from the floor, and then, guys, I think if there's anybody who's got anything online, we can move between them. But if there isn't, we can just carry on with the questions. I mean, I could talk forever, basically, as you probably know. Sure. So, does anybody have a question that they'd like to ask? Yes.
Okay. Well, first of all, thank you for being here. It was really, really interesting.
Oh,
I wanted to go back to when you said, when you talked about how you think about the reader when you're writing. And I wanted to ask you, do you think this attention of the writer to the reader is a more modern thing, something related to our more egalitarian, diffuse literary consumption, modern contemporary literary consumption, compared to old classical literature? And I'm thinking specifically about Dostoevsky, a less classical, really classical, but not in the normal usual sense, which is Notes from Underground. Do you think he's writing for thinking about the readers, or is it just pouring his mind out in the writing? Or at the same time, or he might be, as you say, employing his black humor and making fun of the reader that will read something that might be considered a bit pretentious. I mean, the whole first part is just him obsessing over details and going over descriptions with just the internal voice of the character speaking. Is he thinking about, is he smiling, is he making fun of his readers who will love that because it's Dostoevsky, obviously, or is he not caring at all?
So I think generally our attitude towards readers has changed. I think that, broadly speaking, the whole publishing industry has got very sort of conglomerated and is much more sort of capitalist, and so it's commodified, and in that way it's very much about what readers want. So certainly since the 80s, I think the idea of readability has been privileged over other kinds of prestige when it comes to writing. When it comes to Dostoevsky specifically, I think there are a few different related reasons why he wrote so prolifically. One of them was that he just never had any money. I mean, to say he was a gambling addict is a kind of an understatement. It got to the point where he pawned his wife's overcoat in winter, and I mean, there isn't time even to go into it now, but he never had any money. So he was always very upset about the fact that his contemporaries, who were very well loved, like Turgenev or Tolstoy, they had these amazing big estates where they effectively had a fixed income that they could rely on, and they didn't really have to write, and they got paid more than him per page. That really annoyed him. So he was writing for money. He was in that way he was kind of equivalent to, in English literature, there was this kind of snootiness about what they called Grub Street, the writers who actually had to write to earn a living rather than the aristocratic writers. He was doing that, but with Notes from the Underground specifically, I think that it's really important to be aware of the layer between Dostoevsky's character and Dostoevsky himself. And one of the ways that he flags up that this guy isn't me, that he has a very short preface which people often miss, or sometimes isn't even included in modern editions, where he says, let's be clear, this man doesn't exist. But he positively must exist, because this is just the sort of society we have now, that there must be this kind of crazy ranting man somewhere in a corner in St. Petersburg who's at his absolute wit's end, and is just, in a way it's partly about sticking it to the people who he thought were on the wrong path. There were other writers who he really wanted to prove them wrong. But it's also partly, I think, a book about how kind of paradoxically, how strangely we'll behave in order to preserve our dignity. A lot of the people he was arguing against were sort of saying that if we only understood all of the way that the world works, then we could kind of do away with free will. And one of his big ideas in that book is that actually I would probably stamp on my own foot if it meant proving that I'm free. It might go against my self-interest, but we aren't economic, rationally self-interested beings. We do things that are perverse and weird all the time, if only just to prove that we're free agents. And I think that idea of agency is really important. So he was sort of fighting in a couple of different corners with that book.
Thank you very much.
Great. And yes, we do have a question from online. This is from Rebecca Maro, and she says, how do writers that are just starting out grab the attention of publishers?
Write a really good book. It's difficult. Publishing, the whole industry is sort of set up as a huge funnel. And so there are literary agencies will have, many of them will have sort of thousands of submissions a year, unsolicited submissions, and the agents might only have the opportunity to start working with 5 or 10 new writers each year. Each of those agents will be sending their work to publishers. I probably receive, let's say, 300 submissions a year, and I will then publish 8 to 10 books a year. And so there is this kind of incredible filtering process going on. What it means in practical terms is that you have to, I think, develop quite a thick skin. You have to persevere because, you know, you would even some of the best-known writers of the 20th century got sent lots and lots of rejection letters. It's just that we don't preserve those. That was kind of what I was driving at the very start, actually, is that in retrospect, people always seem to be successful, but of course they do, because they're only telling you about their successes. And I think, you know, it's no insult to receive a rejection letter. If you can get some feedback from them about why it wasn't right for them, then so much the better. I think the other thing about being published in right now is almost to reverse the whole process and to say, you know, what is out there in Waterstones, what's making it onto tables, what do they want to talk about, what's starting conversation, what is it that people want to review, because I think there is sometimes a bit of a kind of disconnect. Part of a publisher's job is to kind of bridge the gap between what people want to write and what they want to read.
All right, thank you.
Hello, yes. Any more questions from the floor? Yeah.
Yeah, so this is kind of a weird question, but I was just wondering, because of your kind of Cypriot background, did you have any kind of Orthodox influences on your own kind of upbringing? And if so, did it attract you to kind of Russian literature?
Yeah, I was baptized Orthodox, and I have lots of memories of being in church, particularly for, you know, what I think of as the highlights, the, you know, births, marriages, and deaths. And I think on some subliminal level, it did kind of give me that center of gravity. It's, I think, in some ways quite a different tradition. So there are things that I maybe will understand more easily or more instinctively than maybe some other non-Orthodox readers. So, you know, one of the things I always find really funny is how appalled most people are in Western Europe about the idea of a priest taking up arms, whereas in Orthodoxy, there's absolutely no contradiction between the church and state. There's no separation there. The, you know, priests were some of the ringleaders of you know, nationalist uprisings in Greece or in Cyprus, and so in that way, I think there's a very kind of robust and actually quite alien version of Christianity, which I think persists in some ways in Russia. So it did allow me to access that. I didn't want it to feel too much like a religious tract, but I think religion is important to him. So yeah.
Brilliant, thank you. Have you got anything more online?
There's another one which is quite a grand question, so prepare yourself. This is from Veranda Seth. How do we read books? Do we separate the artist from the art or not?
It's very difficult to say. I don't know that I have a single answer. I think it depends so much on what the writer is trying to achieve with their work and how far removed their obnoxious opinions are from their work. I think you can get a lot from Dostoevsky's writing and still accept that his attitude to the Jewish community in Russia we would find unacceptable today, and many people in his own time did. but it's not absolutely central to his kind of worldview, and actually you can gain a huge amount from engaging with him in the present day. But there are straightforwardly anti-Semitic works written by other authors that there's nothing really to be gained from engaging with beyond, documenting the way that a society went astray. But I do think it depends a lot on how separate the art and the artists are in each individual case. One example I would draw, there's an amazing bit of typography by a man called Gill, and Gill Sans, I use that font quite often. It's a beautiful font. He was a horrible man. I mean, just horrible. He should have been locked away for his whole life, and ideally without pen and paper. But we have Gill Sans, and it has very little to do with his life in some ways. So I don't know. I think it's hard to make a general rule. I think you have to kind of take it case by case.
Great. Are there any more questions on the floor?
Yeah, I just, you said you receive about 300 submissions a year. How do you go about picking your 8, and like how much leeway do you give it? So you've picked up one from Fresh, do you read 10 pages and then judge it, and then 20 pages and judge it again? Or
Yeah, I mean, the truth is that reading every word of every submission isn't physically possible. And so it does just become a question of triage. I have to kind of make some decisions about what I'm going to spend more time on and less. I think there's a minimum of due diligence you have to do to look through each submission and to give it its due. But I'm not going to pretend that I read to the end of every single thing I get sent. A lot of it, by the time it has reached an agent and a respected agent has polished up the book and prepared it to be ready to submit to a publisher, it's already very high quality a lot of the time, and it then becomes a question of really placing it. So a lot of it is about whether it's right for the kind of books that fall within my remit, whether it might be for a colleague or for another publisher entirely. So just because I'm passing on it, they'll have sent it to 10 people or something, and very often something will get one. If you send it to 10 people and you get 2 offers, you have an auction. It means you've got 8 rejections, but it doesn't matter. And so, yeah, for that part of the process, it's basically a lot about me trying to balance my list, the list I'm curating which is kind of a bit like putting on an exhibition or organizing a music program for a concert hall. That there are tons of worthy artists out there, and it becomes a process of selection.
Thank you.
We've got time for just one more, if this one.
I've just got a quick question. Do you have any last bits of advice to any would-be writers in the audience?
Yeah, I think the most important thing is to read a lot and to get everything you can from every writer, and not worry too much about whether it's how it's going to later influence you, or if it sticks with you, then it's become important to you, and if it falls away, then that's what the brain's really good at doing. And once you've kind of practiced a lot, the good thing about making it a habit is that you get used to writing as a craft, and it begins to feel like something that you can treat as a profession, rather than waiting for the moment of inspiration to strike you. Because if you can wait for the moment of inspiration to strike you, but you won't write very much.
Okay, on that note, we'll end. And that's very good advice indeed, actually, that writing is work. Yep. Okay, thank you so much, Alex. Thank you
very much for having me.
Thank you.
Thank you.